You want energy? Take caffeine. You want better focus? Take lion's mane. You want to stay calm? Take L-theanine. You want
LaToya Cantrell recently released a list of accomplishments that she takes credit for during her 2 terms as mayor.
And that's the topic of this week's commentary by WWL Louisiana political analyst Clancy Dubose.
If you didn't know better, and New Orleanians definitely know better, you'd swear after reading Mayor Cantrell's long list of her accomplishments that she solved every problem facing City Hall while mayor. Well, now, to be fair, Cantrell can take credit for some very good things. She secured the Fair Share plan from the state. It pumped millions toward the city's drainage problems. She led the city through the COVID pandemic, giving New Orleans a far lower infection rate than experts had predicted. And recently, her police chiefs steered NOPD out of the federal consent decree. Unfortunately, Cantrell was terrible at managing her day-to-day duties as mayor, particularly the budget. She turned allies into adversaries unnecessarily. She pretty much checked out as mayor about 2 years ago, and now she's leaving office as New Orleans' first mayor under federal indictment. Oh yeah, and there's that $160 million deficit she's leaving. Sadly, those epic failures overshadow Cantrell's accomplishments. At best, her legacy is a cautionary tale for future mayors and for New Orleans voters.
This has been an expression of opinion by Clancy Dubose. Email your thoughts to commentary@wwltv.com.
The Epstein files are due Friday, December 19th, and either we are going to see them or there is going to be one heck of a fight about it. I'm Ari Melber, lawyer, journalist. You can subscribe to my YouTube breakdowns. This video is going to break down exactly what is required under the new federal law, the Epstein Transparency Act, and what we should expect to see. So let's get right to it. This law is different and stronger than some so-called transparency requirements because it immediately demands the government, in this case largely the Trump DOJ, release these materials online all together Friday. There are some understandable exceptions, like protecting victims, and I'll talk about that in a sec. But the main thing here is this is not one of those reports that goes to Congress and then gets fought over or redacted or diluted over there in the political branch. This stuff is supposed to come right out. So let me read to you from the law itself. There's been a lot of talk about Epstein in this fight and what could happen. But the bottom line here, and it's kind of interesting because if you remember fights about, say, the Mueller report or past investigative reports from the DOJ, there is often a process where they finish the stuff, then they hand the stuff over to Congress, or they review it internally in DOJ, so the prosecutor finishes it and hands it up to the Attorney General or over to Congress, and then there's a delay or a debate about what comes out and how much. Here the law is stronger. It says no later than 30 days after this law, which is Friday, December 19th, the Attorney General, because it requires the DOJ's leader, the Attorney General, to execute this, quote, must make publicly available in a searchable and downloadable format all unclassified records, documents, communications, and investigative materials in the possession of DOJ, including the FBI, which is technically a branch of DOJ, and U.S. Attorney's offices, and that relate to, and then it lists a bunch of categories. I've done actually a different video breaking down those categories, which is the substance, things like the Epstein investigation, the Maxwell investigation, what happened with Epstein's death, flight records. So there's a bunch of stuff in there that's breaking down the topics. But the global point here, and this is section 2, it's called release of the documents relating to Epstein, is that they have to come out in public Friday. So either the DOJ does that, shows that it's trying to do that, all documents, most documents, people can debate it, but there's a pretty understandable set of materials of interest here, and Congress is the one requiring it, and they made Trump sign it when he lost that big clash. So either they drop that by the end of Friday night and show that they're complying in some sense, or they don't. They don't meaningfully comply, or they only drop, say, really old documents or highly redacted documents well beyond what's reasonable, then they would be breaking the law. And we can talk about that step 2 of what happens and what Congress can do. But that's the headline on the material coming out Friday. When you look at then what it could be exempted for or redacted for, what's been really interesting is past laws that provide other secrecy. Grand juries are typically secret. That's federal law. There's a federal Rule 6 that's been in operation for decades. And one question was, okay, you pass a new law that says more sunlight, but what about old laws that say less sunlight? How do you adjudicate that? That's how lawyers put it. And we now have an answer on that we didn't have when the law first passed about, just last month. 3 different judges have ruled that this new law is the winner, and this higher transparency, more sunlight rule beats the past secrecy rules. You can get into why, because judges reason that the new law is more sweeping, that it supersedes the old law, that if laws are in conflict, I'm simplifying because sometimes it depends, but the new law usually, if specifically written, overrules the old one. So you might say that there's a federal rule that says all grand juries are secret in the United States, except for those of sex trafficker Epstein and his convicted conspirator Maxwell. That alone is actually a big change. Most laws are written universally, uniformly. So you get taxed at this rate or that rate. You have grand jury protections for everybody. What the government has done here under this unusually bipartisan, huge ongoing pressure, and what the survivors did, speaking out and building pressure, and Trump having broken his vow, he said he would release and he didn't, all the things we lived through, what Congress has done is basically changed this and said, yes, grand jury secrecy usually, and it's usually a good thing for all these reasons, but not for this. This is too important, and there's been too much cover-up and too many valid questions around the sex trafficking and the pedophilia. So that's a big change, and I mention that here because that means that there's all these grand jury materials that are supposed to come out, and one sign that the DOJ or some people inside the Bondi DOJ are trying to comply, which is what they have to do, what they're supposed to do in the law, is they've gone to 3 separate judges about this, and all 3 have ruled in agreement that the new law allows the release of the grand jury materials, not that there's a caveat or an exception there that you would redact all the grand jury materials. Now, in some cases, if there was a trial like Maxwell, the grand jury materials are basically, think of that as the rough draft or the beginning of that trial, but we've had a whole public trial. So there may not be a ton of new, really important secret info in there. In the Epstein case, though, the grand jury materials could have all kinds of leads about how they built the evidence against him, what that trial was going to look like, because the public never saw it, because he died in prison under suspicious circumstances. The government ruled it suicide, and there was a coroner and there was a report. But Congress, on a bipartisan basis, clearly wants more info about that. So that's also a question in those grand jury materials. In other words, think of it as the first draft or the start of the Epstein case and trial that we never got, could be important. As for the exceptions, they are basically, the way lawyers say this, is narrowly tailored. They're not supposed to be exceptions to black out whole pages or pull whole materials. I'm just looking at some notes I made. For example, they get ahead of the idea of, the government trying to cover up its tracks, whether that's how the Trump DOJ handled this recently, or the Biden-Garland DOJ in the previous 4 years. They had documents, they didn't release them, they didn't do transparency then. The law says that no withholding or redacting is allowed for, quote, to avoid embarrassment, reputational harm, or political sensitivity. And I'll talk about in a minute how that could tee up for a court fight if the Congress thinks that Bondi is breaking that. There are categories allowed for exceptions, and most of them make sense. Remember, it's been Congress that pushed for the transparency. The government, DOJ, has been fighting against it, but these are the exceptions provided by the Congress that wants materials. Nothing about child victims or medical information about them. That's standard. You can't jeopardize an active federal investigation. Bondi said this was totally closed. She wasn't looking into blackmail or any other cases. So if she changes, that raises the question of was she lying then or now? But it would be, I think, legally standard to say, if there's an open probe, you don't want to mess that up with disclosures. Material that's classified is not covered by this act, and that is, again, I mentioned that the grand jury exception is here. They're going to get more than usual, but that kind of honors or continues the precedent that obviously things that are classified stay classified. They have to be declassified by the executive, and we don't know what we don't know. If there are huge parts of this case that do involve classified material legitimately, then they may stay classified. Foreign governments, espionage, whatever it may be. But we, under the rules, will find out after Friday. Friday's the deadline to drop everything online, searchable database. 2 weeks after that, because Congress put this on a fast timeline, DOJ also has to specify, and you may have heard less about this, but DOJ has to specify anything that they did withhold or redact as a category. So that's important because, again, it will give them tools to oversee whether this was done in a real valid way, and if not, to go to court about it. So if there's, for example, 80 pages that are classified and held back because they relate to foreign governments, again, hypothetical, or some other classified reason, national security, they still, 2 weeks later, have to tell Congress that, and then you can debate it. So those are the narrow categories for the exceptions. The rest of the material is supposed to basically drop online. And if you're saying, okay, is this going to work? There have been past examples that have worked. The Church Committee way back in the 70s was dealing with government abuse, and surveillance abuse of national security powers. And over time, they extracted a lot of stuff that was secret and classified, and some of it off the books, unlawful basically, and they got it out in the public realm. There was a JFK records law as well that over time demanded things. And then I could point you to other examples. The 9/11 report was heralded for what it said, but there were big parts that were redacted and were fought over for what it didn't say. And so we will just have to watch, and I don't think people are going to tune this out. There's tremendous public interest, political pressure on whether DOJ under Trump complies or not. And that leads me to a final quick conclusion here, which is if you say that, okay, a lot comes out, everyone weeds through it, like I said, it's got to be online, searchable under the law. That means by Friday midnight, you get the material. If they only put up really redacted things, old things, or nothing, if they completely defy it, then Congress can take this administration to court. And on the one hand, you can say, oh, well, will that take forever? And this whole thing drags out. And that's one of the problems with the way government can work. On the other hand, they made Trump sign this. He lost that big fight. A lot of Republicans now want to keep the heat either on him or away from themselves in Congress. So there's political pressure. The courts have also been very quick to act, as I mentioned, in those 3 different grand jury cases. So you could imagine getting before a court pretty quickly. Let's say there is a fight, either they didn't release or release what Congress says is enough, and by January you're in court, and they can issue, just as the courts have issued subpoenas, which is how we got some of those Epstein emails that were secret and the other photos. A court can issue a subpoena to DOJ the way they did the Epstein estate, and there are lawyers there who have to comply with a lawful subpoena unless they defeat it on appeal. So if they don't comply Friday or comply in a way that Congress thinks is valid, you could end up in court and you could quickly have A, high stakes court battles where people are asking if Trump supports this, why is he fighting it? Why is he holding it back and being secret again, dragging that all out? And B, you could have binding orders that a heck of a lot of lawyers at DOJ would rather comply with and lose their career or law license over. So that's what we're looking at as we track this deadline. You can always subscribe for my breakdowns. Stay informed.
I'm going to start today with the issue that you all wanted to ask about, but I knew you were too shy to do it. And that is what happened 252 years ago tonight, and that is the Boston Tea Party. This is the anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, December 16th, 1773, when about 30 or more young men boarded 3 vessels in Boston Harbor, broke open about 350 chests of tea and threw them overboard in protest of the Parliament's insistence that it could tax Americans, that is, it could pass laws that affected the colonists in North America without their representation in Parliament. And that it's a really big day because it's in American history, because it's really what galvanizes the idea that people do have to stand up against the idea that the government can act without the approval of the people. Just saying. Okay. I'm kidding. Nobody asked about that, but it's big in my mind. I actually would very much like to post a letter about it tonight, but an awful lot of other stuff is going on, so I may not do that. All right. One of the things that happened this weekend that people didn't pay a lot of attention to, and that happened yesterday. I'm off. Today's Tuesday, not Monday. And that's that, of course, what took a lot of oxygen is what Roger Ailes, who was the producer at Fox News, the Fox News channel in the 1990s, and really packaged a lot of right-wing politicians, called the orchestra pit theory of politics. And that's the idea, as he said, that if you have 2 men on a stage and one says, I know how to solve the Middle East question, and the other one falls into the orchestra pit, it's the one who falls into the orchestra pit who's going to get all the attention. And you can see Trump doing this every time attention appears to be sliding away from him. He throws himself into the orchestra pit. And that happened yesterday with the tragic deaths of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner, his wife, who were murdered in their home. The Trump's reaction to that was hideous. And it has actually caused a bit of a rift even in his MAGA supporters, because Rob Reiner was an avid protector of democracy But even people who supported the president loved him for his many extraordinary movies. The Princess Bride, for example, A Few Good Men. You know them. I don't need to go through them all. But people were really horrified by Trump's reaction. And then he doubled down on it. And I want you to hold on to that thought just for a minute. I'm not going to belabor it. I think it's long past time for us to stop focusing on Trump and to recognize that everything he does is an attempt to distract us. And the more that we focus on him, the more he gets to call all the shots. But I do want to point out that his behavior yesterday, and for a long time now, but not just over the thing about the Reiners, but also about a speech he gave that was supposed to be about the holidays, and it turned into something about Peruvian vipers and snakes, and somehow his son was tangled up in it, and so on. What did somebody say to me? The boy ain't quite right. He is his mental acuity has slipped to the point that it's not able to be covered up any longer. And I think what you're going to be seeing now going forward is a lot of scrambling among people who are in the administration or administration adjacent, both to grab as much power as they can, but also to try to get out from any repercussions of their behavior during the administration. So hold on to that thought that Trump's behavior is unacceptable. It is not just a person who is not like many of us, but also somebody who is no longer able to function in any meaningful way. Imagine hiring him to take care of your dog, for example. I think he probably wouldn't do it. I know I wouldn't. And that's of real concern when he is the president of the United States. But while that was going on, and hold that to one side, I do want to call attention to something that didn't get a lot of attention because of the outrage over what was happening yesterday and the sheer horror, of course, of the Reiners murder. And that is that the U.S. military yesterday struck 3 more small boats. These were in the Eastern Pacific, killing 8 more people, which brings the number of people that the U.S. has killed to 95 at least. That's the number that they have provided. And once again, the administration has not given the public or Congress any convincing evidence that these people were, as they say, narco traffickers. Now, I'm going to break that down a little bit because it's important. So what the administration is, actually, I'm going to go back a little bit before I come back to that. One of the hallmarks of this administration is that it is obfuscating. It is throwing up smoke screens over everything that it's doing. So, it keeps getting dragged into court, but when it does get dragged into court, oh, they have the wrong lawyer, or oh, they don't know who was responsible for this, or oh, they can't really answer that, or this court doesn't have jurisdiction, or maybe something else is going on. And so there is this constant battle to pin down what is actually happening and who did it, which, by the way, is a classic hallmark of gaslighting. That is, we can't have this discussion because one half of the party is not willing to recognize even the basis of a discussion. So that's what the administration does anyway. But in the case of these attacks on the small boats, apparently coming from Venezuela, although at least one Colombian has been involved, the administration says that the U.S. is in armed conflict with gangs that are trafficking drugs. But again, there's a lot of obfuscation around it. So they are suggesting that what they are protecting the United States from is illicit fentanyl, claiming things, for example, like each boat could kill 25,000 people, which is just a wild fantasy. But suggests that what is on those boats is the terribly deadly illicit fentanyl. In fact, what came out today is the administration admitted that what may or may not be on those boats is cocaine. And it's cocaine that is being trafficked across Venezuela and then off to the east for traffic to Europe and to Africa. These are not drugs shipments that are destined to the United States for the most part, even if there are drugs on those ships. So the administration is saying that the U.S. is in armed conflict with the drug traffickers, but, and this is so messy because it's intended to be messy, but they are also saying that they do not have to get the permission of Congress to continue the strikes, which under the 1973 War Powers Act, they do. The president can act without the oversight of Congress for 60 days, and then I think it's 60, it might be 90, September, October, November, it might be 90.